Louise Kendrick had spent 40 minutes on her knees scrubbing gum off the underside of a cafeteria table, her back aching in the same familiar way it did most afternoons now. And within 3 hours, the same university would rise to its feet the moment she walked into its boardroom. Patricia Renfield's voice carried across the student union lobby loud enough for a dozen heads to turn, sharp and certain in a way she would never sound again after that afternoon. "We don't have room here for people who can't keep up," she said, and dropped Louise's temporary contractor badge into the trash can beside her without breaking stride. Louise Kendrick stood near the recycling bins in a faded maintenance polo, a mop bucket parked beside her, watching the badge settle among crumpled napkins and an empty soda cup, her expression giving away nothing of what she was actually thinking in that moment. To understand why the woman who'd just been thrown out of a student union lobby would be greeted as chairwoman of the board 3 hours later, we have to go back 4 years to a scholarship application that never should have been denied in the first place. Before we go any further, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Now let's begin. Belhaven University sat on a quiet campus outside Columbus, Ohio, its oldest buildings dating back to 1891, ivy climbing brick the color of dried clay, a bell tower that rang on the hour whether or not anyone below was still listening for it. Students crossed the main quad in loose clusters most afternoons, backpacks slung over one shoulder, the smell of cut grass drifting up from the maintenance crews working the lawns between classes. Louise was 67 years old, 4 years into a quiet arrangement with the facilities department that nobody in that department fully understood, since her contract came through a private vendor account that traced back through 2 shell layers to a family trust bearing her late husband's name rather than her own. She had built that trust from nothing alongside him, decades earlier, running a small regional textbook distribution company that eventually became one of Belhaven's largest single donors, a fact she had never once mentioned to a soul on this campus except the university's outside legal counsel and one very discreet facilities director who had since retired to Florida and kept the secret out of simple loyalty rather than any ongoing obligation. She came back to campus in a maintenance uniform 3 or 4 times a year, unannounced, because she'd learned long ago that endowment reports and glossy annual newsletters told you almost nothing true about how a university actually treated the students who depended on it most, the ones working 12 hours a week in dining halls and libraries just to keep their financial aid intact, the students least likely to ever be asked their opinion in a satisfaction survey. Louise believed the clearest window into an institution's character sat not in its donor dinners, but in its break rooms, and she trusted her own 2 eyes over any report a vice president ever handed her. 26-year-old Annabelle Cho worked as a financial aid coordinator in the same building, 8 months into the job, still cataloging in her mind the small inconsistencies she noticed, but hadn't yet found the nerve to raise with anyone above her. Annabelle had taken the position straight out of graduate school, grateful for steady work in a difficult hiring year, and had spent her first few months simply trying to learn the systems well enough not to make visible mistakes in front of colleagues who had years more experience than she did. She'd watched her supervisor, Patricia Renfield, quietly steer certain work-study students toward what Patricia called flexible scheduling arrangements, extra unlogged hours that never appeared on the students' timesheets, hours Patricia justified by reminding them, gently but unmistakably, how easily a financial aid file could be flagged for review if a student stopped being cooperative. Annabelle had drafted an email about it twice and deleted it both times, telling herself she needed more evidence before she risked her own still fragile position in that office, the same calculation she suspected every other junior staff member in that department had quietly run at some point, without ever comparing notes with each other. Patricia Renfield had run the financial aid support office for 5 years, a woman who spoke in the calm, reasonable tone of someone who had convinced herself every uncomfortable decision she made was simply the practical cost of keeping the department's numbers where the university wanted them, a tone she'd refined so thoroughly over the years that even she sometimes seemed to believe it herself. 3 years earlier, the office's staffing budget had been cut nearly in half during a round of university-wide belt-tightening. While the volume of student aid cases handled by her team stayed exactly the same, an arithmetic Patricia had quietly solved by leaning on the work-study students themselves, students who had far more to lose than she did, if they ever complained. That particular Tuesday, 20-year-old Jamal Ostrander stood at the financial aid counter holding his class schedule, explaining, as calmly as he could manage, that he couldn't take on 2 more unpaid hours a week without missing his afternoon lab, the one prerequisite he needed to stay on track for his major. "I understand it's inconvenient," Patricia said, her tone pleasant in the way that made the words underneath it land harder. "But the office genuinely needs the coverage this week, and I'd hate for anything to complicate your aid renewal this semester." She let the sentence sit there a moment longer than it needed to, watching Jamal's face carefully the entire time. Jamal went very still, understanding exactly what she meant, without her ever saying it directly, his hand tightening slightly around the folded schedule in his fingers. "I can rearrange the lab," he said finally, his voice quieter than it had been a moment earlier. Patricia smiled, satisfied, and slid a new schedule sheet across the counter for him to sign. He agreed to the extra hours. He always did. Louise, mopping the hallway outside the counter, that same afternoon, had already seen enough over the previous 2 visits to know this wasn't an isolated moment. And she'd made a note of the exact phrasing Patricia used, the specific threat wrapped inside something that would read, on paper, as concern, the same careful phrasing she'd now heard variations of at least 3 separate times over her past 2 visits alone. She said nothing that day. She kept mopping because she'd learned that the fullest picture came from patience rather than a premature confrontation, and because she wanted to be certain, beyond any reasonable doubt, before she let anyone else act on what she'd seen. 15 minutes later, Patricia found Louise resting on an overturned bucket near the supply closet, catching her breath, after the building's ancient elevator had stalled twice on her. That morning while she hauled cleaning equipment between floors, her knees aching in a way she'd stopped mentioning to anyone years earlier. "You're on the clock," Patricia said, not unkindly at first, more like a woman reciting a policy she'd recited many times before to many other people in that same hallway. "I don't pay this contract for sitting." Louise stood, apologized, and picked the mop back up, saying nothing about her knees, or the elevator, or the 6 flights she'd already climbed twice that day, letting the moment pass the way she'd learned to let 100 similar moments pass over the years, filing it away rather than fighting it. Patricia watched her a moment longer, something calculating behind her eyes, a decision visibly taking shape behind an expression she was clearly trying to keep neutral. "I've had concerns about the reliability of this maintenance contract for a while now," she said, mostly to herself, though loud enough for Louise to hear. "Maybe it's time we brought in someone else." Louise met her gaze evenly, said nothing in response, and continued down the hallway with her cart, understanding that Patricia had just decided something and was only waiting for an excuse to act on it. The excuse arrived within the hour. Louise had paused near the student union lobby to help an elderly visitor locate the admissions office, walking the woman slowly to the correct hallway rather than simply pointing, a small kindness that cost her perhaps 4 extra minutes she hadn't accounted for on her afternoon rounds. Patricia spotted her returning to her cart and crossed the lobby with quick, sharp steps, her heels clicking against the tile in a rhythm that made 2 nearby students look up from their phones. "Where exactly have you been?" she asked, several students nearby glancing up again at the sharpness in her voice. Louise explained, briefly, calmly, gesturing toward the admissions wing. Patricia's mouth tightened, her patience visibly running out all at once. "We don't have room here for people who can't keep up," she said, loud enough for a dozen heads to turn. And she reached into Louise's cart, pulled out the laminated temporary contractor badge Louise wore each visit, and dropped it into the trash can beside her without breaking stride. "You're done here," she said. "Don't bother coming back tomorrow." Louise stood near the recycling bins for a long moment, watching the badge settle among crumpled napkins, saying nothing, doing nothing that might have looked, to anyone watching, like more than quiet embarrassment. Annabelle, crossing the lobby with a stack of files, saw the whole exchange and felt something twist in her chest, the particular discomfort of watching someone treated exactly the way she'd been quietly worrying about students being treated for months, except this time in full public view, with nobody stepping in. From Annabelle's angle near the elevator bank, the entire scene had unfolded, with an almost unbearable slowness, Patricia's hand reaching into the cart, the badge arcing into the trash, the dozen students nearby glancing up, and then quickly back down at their phones, each of them making the same small calculation Annabelle recognized instantly, because she'd made it herself so many times that year. She thought, for just a moment, about walking over, about saying something, anything, to the woman standing alone by the bins. She didn't. She told herself, the way she always told herself, that an entry-level coordinator interrupting her own supervisor in a public lobby would accomplish nothing except ending her own employment sooner than Louise's, a piece of arithmetic that felt reasonable in the moment and would feel considerably less reasonable to her only a few hours later. There was, underneath Patricia's cruelty, that afternoon, one detail that complicated her, as a person rather than a villain. She had started in that office 15 years earlier, as a work-study student herself, one of the university's very first cohorts under a newly expanded aid program, arriving on campus with almost nothing and depending entirely on that assistance to finish her degree. Without accumulating debt, she had no way of repaying. She had spent her entire adult career terrified of the version of herself that might have existed if that program had ever failed her the way she now quietly failed the students beneath her, replaying, more often than she would ever admit, the specific fear of a single administrator deciding her aid wasn't worth the paperwork anymore. Somewhere along the way, protecting the program's numbers on paper had become, in her mind, indistinguishable from protecting the students it served, a substitution she had made, so gradually she no longer noticed the difference between the two, each small compromise justified by the one before it until the distance between her intentions and her actions had grown too wide to see clearly anymore. It didn't excuse a single threat she'd made to Jamal, or a single hour she'd stolen from a dozen students who couldn't afford to refuse her. It only meant that somewhere underneath the clipped voice and the trash can was a woman who had once needed exactly the kind of protection she was now denying to people who reminded her, uncomfortably, of who she used to be. At 3 p.m. that same afternoon, entirely unconnected to anything that had happened in the lobby, Belhaven's Board of Trustees convened for its regular quarterly meeting in the university's administration building, a session that had been fixed on the university calendar for 11 months, since the board met on the same schedule every year, without exception, long before anyone could have known what that particular Tuesday afternoon would otherwise contain. President Callender, Belhaven's president for the past 6 years, stood at the head of the long walnut table reviewing his notes, a stack of printed agendas fanned neatly in front of each empty chair, when the door opened, and a woman in a faded maintenance polo walked in, a laminated visitor badge, from the front desk still clipped crookedly to her collar, where she'd pinned it herself only minutes earlier. President Callender looked up, and his face went through several things in quick succession: confusion, recognition, and finally something like relief. "Madam Chair," he said, rising immediately from his seat, the rest of the room following his lead a half-second behind him, with the particular scraping of chairs that happens when a room realizes something important just walked in. "We'd hoped you might join us in person this quarter," he said. Louise nodded once, unbothered by her own uniform, and took the seat that had clearly been reserved at the head of the table the entire time, a nameplate already sitting there reading simply L. Kendrick, Chair. Around the room, several trustees who had met her only through video calls sat up straighter, exchanging glances that suggested this was not, for at least half of them, entirely new information, while two newer board members exchanged a far more startled look with each other. Patricia Renfield had been called into that same meeting to present the Financial Aid Office's quarterly compliance report, standing near the door with a folder of prepared slides, when Louise walked in wearing the exact uniform Patricia had mocked less than 2 hours earlier. The folder slipped slightly in Patricia's grip. Her face moved, through disbelief, then confusion, then a slow, sinking recognition that made her knees feel suddenly unreliable beneath her. "Please, sit," Louise said to the room generally, her voice carrying the same even register it had held all morning, while mopping hallways 3 floors below. "Ms. Renfield, why don't you begin with your report?" Patricia opened her mouth, closed it, and finally managed to start reading, from her slides in a voice noticeably thinner than the one she'd used in the lobby, her hands trembling faintly around the edges of the folder. She spoke for perhaps 90 seconds, before Louise raised one hand, not sharply, just enough to pause the room, the gesture small, but immediately effective in a way that told everyone present exactly who had actually been running that meeting the entire time. "Before we continue," Louise said, "I'd like to introduce someone the board engaged 2 months ago, following an anonymous concern raised through the ethics hotline." A woman near the side wall stood, a folder of her own in hand, her posture that of someone accustomed to presenting difficult findings to rooms that didn't want to hear them. "My name is Renata Ashworth," she said. "I'm an independent compliance auditor retained by the board's ethics committee to review work-study scheduling practices in financial aid." She opened her folder, the pages inside tabbed and color-coded. "Over the past 8 weeks, our office has interviewed 11 current work-study students and reviewed 18 months of internal scheduling logs, cross-referencing timesheet data against building badge swipe records to establish an independent timeline. The findings," Renata continued, "showed a consistent pattern in which students were directed to work hours beyond their approved federal work-study allocations, unrecorded on official timesheets, with several students independently describing implied threats to their financial aid status if they declined, each account corroborated by at least one other student's separate description of a nearly identical conversation." She placed a single printed page on the table, sliding it toward the center, where every trustee could see it. "This is a summary," she said. "The full report, including student testimony transcripts, with names redacted for their protection, runs to 41 pages. And copies are available to any trustee who wishes to review it in full before the vote." Patricia's hand found the back of a nearby chair, her knuckles going pale against the dark wood. "That's," she started, "an exaggeration of a scheduling flexibility program, entirely voluntary. Students were never," her sentence trailing off, as she seemed to lose track of which defense she'd meant to reach for first. Annabelle Cho, seated near the back of the room, as the office's junior representative, found herself standing before she'd fully decided to, her chair scraping against the floor in the sudden quiet. "That's not accurate," she said, her voice shaking slightly, but clear enough to carry to every corner of the room. "I've watched this happen for months. I should have said something sooner, and I didn't, because I was scared of exactly this moment, of standing in a room like this one, and having every eye turned toward me instead of her. But it happened, and it's still happening to a student right now, this week, named Jamal Ostrander, and probably to others, whose names I don't even know yet." The room went very quiet, the particular quiet that settles over a space once someone has finally said the thing everyone in the building had been quietly avoiding, a silence with weight to it, the kind that presses down rather than simply existing. Patricia looked at Annabelle, then at Louise, then at the printed summary sitting on the table between them, her mouth working, without producing anything further, her eyes moving across the faces of trustees who, only an hour earlier, she would have expected to take her side, without a second thought. Louise studied her for a long moment, before speaking again, her voice never rising above the same even register she'd used all morning, while mopping hallways 3 floors below this exact room. "I spent this morning mopping the hallway outside your office," she said. "I watched you tell a 20-year-old young man that his financial aid might become complicated if he didn't agree to work hours nobody would pay him for. I watched you throw away a badge belonging to a woman you decided couldn't keep up in front of a dozen students because you assumed nobody watching had any power to answer for it." Her voice never rose. "You were wrong on both counts, and I imagine, somewhere underneath the version of yourself you've built for this office, you already suspected that." Patricia's voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper, all the earlier certainty gone out of it entirely. "I never meant for any student to actually lose their aid," she said. "I just needed the numbers to hold together. And I didn't know another way to make that happen without more staff. I was never given, not after the cuts, not with the caseload we were carrying." Louise nodded slowly, neither dismissing the explanation nor accepting it as an excuse. "I believe that's probably true," she said. "It doesn't change what it cost the people beneath you, and it doesn't change that you had other choices available to you that you simply never took." President Callender looked to the board's general counsel, who nodded once, a brief exchange that settled the matter, without further discussion needed. "Effective today, Patricia Renfield's employment with the university is terminated," he said, his voice formal, but not unkind. "The findings in this report will be forwarded to the U.S. Department of Education's Federal Student Aid Office for review under work-study compliance regulations, given the potential violations involved." Patricia did not argue. She gathered her folder, with hands that had gone visibly unsteady, and walked out of the room, without another word, the door closing softly behind her, the sound of it somehow louder than anything that had been said in the previous 10 minutes. The board voted, before the meeting adjourned, to establish an emergency support fund for work-study students facing exactly the kind of pressure Jamal had described, administered independently of any single department supervisor, with a direct, anonymous reporting channel routed straight to the ethics committee rather than through any manager who might have reason to discourage its use, the vote passing unanimously, within minutes of being proposed. Nobody suggested naming it after Louise, and she made clear, before anyone could, that she wouldn't have accepted it if they had, adding only that the fund should carry the name of the program it was meant to protect rather than any single person's name at all. Jamal Ostrander learned what had happened 3 days later, called into a small meeting where a financial aid administrator explained, gently, that his aid status had never actually been at risk, that the additional hours he'd been asked to work were being reversed and back paid immediately, and that a new office policy now required any change to a student's assigned hours to be logged and approved by someone outside his direct supervisor's authority, a small procedural safeguard that would have caught the whole pattern months earlier if it had existed sooner. He sat with that information for a long moment, turning his old schedule sheet over in his hands before asking, quietly, whether the woman who'd been fired had known what she was doing the whole time. The administrator considered the question carefully before answering that she almost certainly had, and that knowing it hadn't stopped her either, which was, in its own way, the more important thing for him to understand going forward, more important, in fact, than anything about Patricia herself. Annabelle Cho was asked to help design the new reporting system. Over the following month, a project she approached with a specific, careful attention that came directly from having watched, for 8 months, exactly how quiet a wrong thing could stay before someone finally said it out loud. She built the intake form herself, testing it twice, with students from 3 different departments, before submitting it for approval, adding a feature that let a student flag a concern anonymously at first and only reveal their identity once they felt ready to. A small design choice born entirely out of remembering her own 8 months of hesitation. She was determined that nobody after her would need 8 months and a room full of trustees to finally feel safe enough to speak. And she told her own supervisor, once the system launched, that she considered it the most important thing she'd built in her career, so far, more important than anything, with her name officially attached to it. Louise returned to a maintenance uniform the following week, mopping the same hallways, refilling the same paper towel dispensers, unrecognized by most of the students, who passed her, without a glance, exactly as she preferred it. She still believed, more firmly now than before, that the truest measure of any institution sat in exactly those unremarkable hallways, in the small, unwitnessed moments nobody thought worth reporting to a board, the moments that never made it into an annual report or a donor newsletter, but told you everything that actually mattered. She kept coming back, uniform and all, because some habits she'd decided long ago were worth keeping precisely, because the reason for keeping them never really went away, no matter how many boardrooms eventually learned her name. Narrator reflection: the moment I keep returning to isn't the boardroom. It's the hallway 15 minutes earlier, when Patricia found Louise sitting on an overturned bucket and told her the contract didn't pay for sitting. That's such an ordinary sentence. It's the kind of thing said in workplaces every single day, dressed up as reasonable, dressed up as policy. And it's exactly the kind of sentence the Federal Student Aid Office has spent years trying to catch through work-study compliance reviews, because the harm rarely announces itself as harm. It shows up as a scheduling note, a soft warning about aid renewal, a phrase engineered to sound like concern rather than the threat it actually is. What stays with me about Patricia isn't that she was uniquely cruel. It's that she built her entire justification out of a fear she once had every right to feel, and never once stopped to notice the moment that fear turned into the exact thing she used to be afraid of. I don't think most people who end up protecting a broken system started out wanting to. I think most of them, like Patricia, started out needing protection themselves and forgot, somewhere along the way, that the goal was never supposed to be surviving it alone. So here's what I keep asking. When you've been hurt by a system, does surviving it teach you to protect the next person from it, or does it just as easily teach you how to make someone else absorb what you once had to?